Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Thank you all for your ongoing support of our live streams and for all your contributions and support. We couldn't be doing this without your help, so thank you so very much. For those of you who may be new to Dan's programs, we'll be taking questions in about 30 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will manage your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program. She always does such a great job managing so many questions, and she'll try to get to as many as possible. It is now my pleasure to welcome Professor Dan Schnur and Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Dan, we have some heavy-hitting lineup of topics today. Too bad there's not too much news going on. Let me well, excuse me, what?
That's been our challenge almost every week, Kim. Not nearly enough to talk about, right?
Yeah, it's making me punchy, I know. We have three great topics, so let me just get those out of the way and turn this over to you, Dan. Now comes the hard part. Biden takes on COVID. What happens to the Trump impeachment now? And America on the world stage, Biden's international agenda. And I know our audience will have so many more questions and so many more areas that they want you to cover. They're looking forward to this so much. So take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Kim. I'm really looking forward to it too, as I do every week. And as always, thanks so much to all of you for joining us for these conversations. And as we now move further into the Biden era, as Kim said, we've got no shortage of things to talk about. But topic number one for us today, and topic number one for Joe Biden for quite some time now, is of course going to be the coronavirus challenge. And during the campaign, as I know most of you remember, candidate Biden made three broad promises on how he would act to confront COVID if elected president upon taking office. One, he promised a federal mask mandate. And while the federal government is not empowered to require every American to wear a mask at all times, Biden felt that coupled with his bully pulpit from the White House, he could require masks on all federal government property and require masks for all interstate travel, planes, trains, buses, and so on. And so it's a somewhat limited approach, but it's one that's already gotten some pushback from more than a few red state governors. But Biden and his advisors believe that even though he's relatively limited on that front and what he can do in terms of actual public policy, that a strong and clear message from the White House will hopefully encourage more Americans to abide by those guidelines. His second promise is, he said, that Biden promised to reopen the majority of America's public schools, elementary and secondary schools, within 100 days of taking office. And that's already shaping up to be a major, major fight because the teachers' unions, advocating on behalf of their members and their health, have been arguing very strongly about reopening schools, not only until after the teachers have been vaccinated, but until other health parameters in those schools' communities have been met. And in the weeks ahead, we're going to see a very, very nasty fight between the teachers and their unions on one hand, and parents on the other, particularly parents from minority communities and other underrepresented communities whose children, of course, are suffering disproportionately academically by the continued absence from in-person learning. We're already seeing a hint of that in California, as Governor Newsom has struggled with this issue, and we'll talk more about that next week, is one of our key issues. But promise number two for Biden was to get the schools open again. We'll see how that progresses. And then third, candidate Biden promised that he would accomplish the goal of 100 million vaccinations during his first 100 days in office. And he's already come under some criticism for that not being ambitious enough. And Biden said just yesterday that, in fact, he believed that perhaps the country could achieve 150 million vaccinations within his first 100 days. And that would obviously make it much easier to get to a level of community saturation by summer, which is, I think, at this point, what most of us are hoping for. The next fight brewing on that front, as I think most of you know, is once there's an adequate number of vaccinations available, in what order should we be vaccinated? And the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, announced just yesterday that the state was going to revise its order for providing those vaccinations. And once essential workers have been provided, the vaccinations are going to be given in descending order of age. We've already talked about, they've already started focusing on those above the age of 75 and above the age of 65. But it now looks like rather than focusing on an individual's profession, their age range is going to determine whether that vaccination comes or not. But in any case, third promise for Biden was 100 million, perhaps now more, vaccinations within his first 100 days in office. But the big ticket for Joe Biden at this point, the most important challenge, is the COVID relief bill, which he and his advisors have begun negotiating with Congress. Now that proposal is roughly $1.9 trillion for stimulus checks, for vaccinations, for unemployment benefits, and for increased testing, and for additional money for small businesses, for local and state government, for schools and hospitals, and others. And we're going to dig into the details of that proposal in just a minute. But before we do, Claire, if we can put up our first question and see what our group thinks is going to come out of these negotiations between Biden and Congress. Our first question today for all of you is, what type of COVID relief package do you think will pass? Do you think it will be, number one, a major package with bipartisan support of the type I just described? Second, do you think it will be a fairly large-scale package, a major package, but a straight party line vote with only Democratic support? Third, will it be a more targeted bipartisan package, a smaller package, both Democratic and Republicans supporting a smaller and more focused effort? Or fourth, there's just no COVID relief bill will pass, at least not in the immediate future. And so let's see what our group has to say, Claire. Now look at that, 62% believe, almost 2/3 of you believe that there will be bipartisan support, which is something that Biden has clearly indicated is his preference. But it appears that you believe that in order to get that bipartisan support, the package is going to have to become significantly smaller, and I think that's likely. 26% say a major package will pass with only Democratic support on straight party lines, and we'll talk in just a minute about the reconciliation process, which would allow that to happen. A smaller number, 12%, say that Republicans will come around and pass a major, more sweeping package with bipartisan support. And 1% of you say that Congress is not going to be able to get its act together and will not pass a COVID bill. But most people say a smaller but bipartisan package. And although Biden hasn't quite phrased it in those terms, it seems pretty clear that that's his goal going forward. Now, one of the things that Biden's White House has done already is they've reconvened a group of 16 US senators, so-called Gang of 16, that were instrumental in the passage of the last COVID relief bill back in December. And the Biden White House has reconvened that group, and they had their first meeting on Sunday. And what's interesting about that meeting is not only did Republicans offer their concerns that this package was perhaps too large and needed to be more specifically focused, but some of the Democrats in that meeting raised the same concerns. And you heard from both Republicans and Democrats the need to target the benefits as it related to COVID relief somewhat more specifically, which seems to be heading in the direction that all of you predicted in the last question. Now, as I said, Biden wants a bipartisan bill. He ran on unity, he ran on bipartisanship, and that's, he stressed it in his inaugural address last Wednesday. And that's the way he wants to govern, particularly on this first critically important, high visibility piece of legislation. But as much as Biden wants a bipartisan bill, he understands, there's a lot of Democrats in Congress who understand, that Republicans might not give him everything he wants. And so the question becomes, how much do you compromise in order to get Republican support. And here's what I think you'll see. As we'll talk about in a couple minutes, the President Trump's impeachment trial is going to begin 2 weeks from today. And that's really the window in my mind for Biden to pass a bipartisan bill. If he can get a bill done or almost done by the time the impeachment trial starts on February 9th, in 2 weeks, then he'll have accomplished his goal. But if by then they're still haggling back and forth and they're not particularly close to a solution, then the pressure is going to increase on Biden from congressional Democrats to go at it alone with a party line bill that might be more ambitious, but won't enjoy Republican support. Now, as all of you know, because you follow this stuff very closely, you know that the Senate can't pass legislation on most subjects without 60 votes. And we'll talk about the filibuster in just a minute. But the US Senate actually can pass some legislation through a process called reconciliation. And they can pass legislation using reconciliation with only 51 votes, and as opposed to 60. Now, a couple of tricks, a couple of things to keep in mind as it relates to this reconciliation process. One, it can only be used once per year, once per budget bill. So if Biden plays that card now, it's not going to be available to him again until next January. Second, and more important, reconciliation is only supposed to be used for matters related directly to taxes and the budget. And so while it's generally agreed that most of what the president is asking for in this COVID relief bill could be accomplished with a 51 vote majority through reconciliation, there's a lot that couldn't be. For example, Biden has called for an increase in the minimum wage at a national level to $15 per hour. Regardless of whether you think that's a good or a bad idea, it's generally agreed that that can't be done through reconciliation with a majority vote. So that would have to wait. But there's already great pressure on Biden to say, look, the Republicans don't want to work with you. Let's pass the COVID bill with 51 votes through reconciliation and let's move on. Biden's got a window, but it's only a couple weeks long. The other option available to him, which Biden is already facing great pressure from his own ranks, is giving up the filibuster altogether. It now requires 60 votes to pass most legislation in the Senate, this reconciliation process notwithstanding. And there have been a number of Democrats for many years who believe that getting rid of that filibuster and passing all legislation by 51 votes is a preferable option. This was the topic of a major fight between Senator Chuck Schumer, the incoming majority leader, and Mitch McConnell, the outgoing majority leader, that they just resolved last night. But right now it appears that while there are a lot of Democrats, particularly in the progressive wing of the party, who would like to get rid of the filibuster, Biden has said in the past that's not something he wants to do. And a lot of his allies argue that getting rid of the filibuster and passing all legislation by 51 votes would very strongly undermine the calls for bipartisanship and unity that he's been voicing over the course of his campaign and the first days of his presidency. So the filibuster is probably around for a while. The passing of the COVID bill by reconciliation, though, let's see where we are in 2 weeks, and not on next week's program, but the week after that. Let's go into a little bit more detail and decide if the Democrats are going to try to push this forward on a straight party line vote or not. Let's move on to our next topic. I mentioned briefly, of course, the upcoming impeachment trial of former President Trump in the United States Senate. Just last night, the House impeachment managers appointed by Speaker Pelosi delivered the documents of impeachment to the Senate officially, which means that officially the Senate trial on whether or not to convict former President Trump starts today. Now, McConnell and Schumer have agreed to put off all but the formalities of the trial for a couple weeks. The Biden administration understandably wants to try to confirm a number of their cabinet members. They do want to get started on a COVID bill and other legislative priorities. And as McConnell has argued, the defendant, former President Trump, deserves some time to prepare his defense. So 2 weeks from today is when we'll see that impeachment trial begin. But even before that, even before the conviction trial in the Senate actually starts, already this afternoon, we're going to get a first indicator of what the prospects are for the Senate's ability to convict Trump of the matters for which he was impeached by the House of Representatives. This afternoon, Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky has announced that he will force a vote in the Senate on whether it's constitutional to put a former president on trial for impeachment charges. We know from the Constitution, it's very, very clear that a president can be impeached. That's one of the tools, the most significant tool that the legislative branch has against a president who abuses his authority or is accused of abusing his authority. But it's not quite as clear on whether a former president can be impeached. And Rand Paul is going to force that vote today. And it could be a possible test case for how the Senate might vote in the trial itself. So we'll talk about this for a few more minutes before we move on to our next topic. But before we do, Claire, maybe we can put up our second question and ask our group to offer their thoughts on what they think will happen in a couple weeks when Trump's conviction trial begins in the Senate. Now, it takes 2/3 of the Senate, 67 votes, to convict a former president. And at that point, presumably the Senate would vote on whether to ban him from running for office in the future. 67 votes, of course, means that 17 Republicans would have to vote to convict Trump for the conviction to hold. So our question to you is, how many Republican votes do you think how many Republican senators do you think will vote to convict Trump in the Senate when that trial takes place? 17 or more, enough to convict? Oh, if we can put those back, Claire. Okay. Look at that, 17 or more, 12%, but 6 to 16, somewhat over half. Some senators, you think, will vote for conviction of Trump, but not enough to convict him. That's 61% of the vote. 27% of you think just a few, 1 to 5 senators, and nobody thinks that there'll be no Republican votes for conviction, which means that all of you are convinced at least that Senator Romney will repeat the vote that he cast for impeachment last year. But only 12% say there'll be enough to convict, and we'll probably have more of a sense today after the vote on Rand Paul's bill, because most of the Republican senators who have announced that they will not vote to convict Trump, they're not defending his behavior from January 6th, not at all. What they're saying instead is that it's unconstitutional to convict a former president as opposed to a sitting president. Many other Republican senators are saying even if he did something that would be impeachable at the time, he's not president anymore, so it's simply not relevant. Not that many senators, I don't think any senators are defending Trump's actions of January 6th, but on questions of constitutionality and relevance, it looks like a lot of them are looking for ways to avoid voting to convict, which would explain the votes that you came to. So where are we as it relates to the 50 Republican senators? 15 senators, just short of the number necessary, 15 Republican senators say they are open to conviction. That doesn't mean they're committed to doing so, but it means it's something that they're willing to consider, depending on how the trial goes. 31 Republican senators are firmly opposed. They've said no way will they vote to convict the president. And that leaves 4 who are unknown. And in order for Trump to be convicted, all 15 of those who say that they are open to it, plus at least 2 of these 4 senators who've not spoken publicly, would have to vote to convict. And in case you're interested, those 4 senators are Senator Crapo of Idaho, Senator Deborah Fisher of Nebraska, Senator Mike Lee of Utah, and Senator Todd Young of Indiana. So for Trump to be convicted, all 15 of those who say they're open to it would have to vote for it, and at least 2 of those 4. Now we'll talk more about this, of course, once the trial is underway. But here's another thing to keep in mind before we move on to our third and last topic for the day. Most people at this point, most of the players at this point, most of the participants at this point want this over. The Republicans want it done. They want it behind them because it's a lousy vote to have to cast either way. Biden wants this done quick. He's made it pretty clear he's not all that excited about the impeachment. He said it should be up to Congress, but he wants public and political and congressional attention on his legislative package, COVID and other priorities. We're not yet clear on how the congressional Democrats are going to approach this. They'll be under some pressure from the White House to run a pretty quick trial, just in a couple days and let the vote happen, then go on. But there are at least some members of the Democratic Congressional Caucus who do want a more intense and a more expansive trial, to call witnesses and to take on other more detailed arguments. So we don't yet know how long this is going to go, but there's going to be a lot of pressure on the House Democrats or on the Senate Democrats as well to do this quickly rather than over a longer period of time, particularly if it appears that the Senate will not convict the president. Now, what's particularly important about this, though, is not the impeachment itself, but what it represents. And that is an absolute bloody war that has erupted within the Republican Party, as we talked about last week, between President Trump's allies and his opponents, between, for lack of a better term, the Trump wing of the party and the more traditional Republicans who really want him off the stage. Last week, Trump began talking out loud about the possibility of starting a third party, a so-called Patriot Party, to run in future elections. That now seems pretty unlikely, but within the Republican Party, that pro-Trump versus pre-Trump divide is just going to get bigger. One important step was taken yesterday. One important decision was made yesterday, which is worth keeping in mind as it relates to this fight within the Republican Party. Senator Rob Portman of Ohio, who's considered to be one of the more establishment Republicans in the Senate. He worked in George W. Bush's White House. He served in the House of Representatives. He's conservative, but very much of an institutionalist establishment Republican. Senator Portman from Ohio announced yesterday that he's not going to run for re-election. He basically said, we're not getting anything done, that the Congress is too partisan, this is too ugly, I'm going to find another way to serve. And that, to me, sounds like a senator who does not think he's going to be back in the majority in 2 years. Senator Toomey of Pennsylvania, Senator Burr of North Carolina are Republicans who've already announced their retirements as well. And there's a lot of speculation that other Republican senators who are up in 2022, most notably Charles Grassley of Iowa and Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, are thinking about retiring as well. And so as the establishment wing of the party begins to step back, that creates more opportunities for Trump and his allies to stake their claim on the Republican Party. This is a fight that's not going to be settled anytime soon. We're going to see it continue between Trump's allies and his opponents, continue through the midterm elections next year for control of the Republican Party. And in all likelihood, whether Trump himself runs for president or not in 2024, this will end up defining the Republican primary fight in the next presidential election as well. So what do all of you think? What does the future hold for the Republican Party? Do you think that Trump starts a new political party, which he speculated about last week? Does Trump stay in the Republican Party, but traditional Republicans start a new party in order to distance themselves from them? Or third, do both the former president and his opponents both stay in the Republican Party, and the internal fight that I've just described continues? So what do you think is next for Republicans? Let's see what they got, Claire. 78%, 3/4 of you believe that both factions stay within the Republican Party and the internal fight continues. 16% say Trump starts a new party. 5% think that the more traditional Republicans start a party of their own. We'll obviously be talking much more about this in the weeks ahead, but at least for now, it sounds like most of you believe, and I think you're probably right on this, that the real fight continues within the Republican Party. Now, there's no shortage of disagreements within the Democratic Party, too. We alluded to them briefly earlier today, and we'll be talking about those divisions going forward. But what I want to do for a few minutes before I wrap up my portion of the program and turn it over to all of you and your questions is I want to talk just a little bit about the new president and the rest of the world, Joe Biden, on the international stage. Now, in the weeks ahead, we'll take a look at each of the world's hotspots individually and in more detail. But today I want to offer just a few general thoughts to begin that conversation. One is what the rest of the world thinks of the United States right now at this point in our history. Number two, what are the biggest changes we expect to see under President Biden from Trump's approach to the world and to foreign policy? And third, the areas of continuity that we're likely to see, where Biden is probably not going to change direction in a very impactful way from Trump's approach. So it's the world's view of the United States. I saw a really wonderful quote last week from the head of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And he was asked to assess what a Biden administration would mean for Europe and the rest of the world. And his response was, quote, "Americans have a new president, but not a new country." Americans have a new president, but not a new country. And I think that's a really, really smart way of looking at these questions. Because even though Biden comes at most of these international challenges in a much different way than Trump does, he still represents the same country. And the United States of America that was becoming more isolationist and more protectionist and more wary of international involvement, that party didn't magically disappear, either on election day or on inauguration day last Wednesday. And so while Biden will make several changes, and we'll talk about those going forward, he represents the same country that Donald Trump did. And that means that a lot of the things that Trump, while Biden is going to change course on a lot of issues that Trump addressed in his 4 years, in a lot of ways, Biden's going to follow Trump's lead, not because it's Donald Trump, but because it's where the majority of Americans want to see our country on the global stage. So let me ask you, and we'll use this to guide our decision-making for our programming for the next several weeks. What do all of you think is Joe Biden's greatest foreign policy challenge? And obviously, we don't have nearly enough room. We only get 5 options on this platform. So we can't list nearly all of the international challenges that Biden may face. But well, here's a few. Is it Russia? Is it China? Is it Iran? Is it Europe? Or something else that we didn't list here? I didn't list North Korea, didn't list Israel, didn't list Latin America. So what do all of you think? If Biden, out of all of Biden's significant foreign policy challenges, which do you think is the most important and the most urgent? 77%, more than 3/4 say China. Only 13% say Russia, 9% say Iran, 1% say Europe. And so let's agree, Jessica and Claire, that next week China will be one of our issues along with the COVID education discussion. So we'll definitely come back to that in more detail next week. But what I want to do for just a couple of minutes is offer more broadly, as I said, a couple of areas where Biden will either follow, continue in Trump's direction, or take off on his own course. The biggest change by far, as we've discussed before, will be an emphasis on multilateralism, on working with other countries, on rebuilding and strengthening alliances. And so that even if Biden's goals do not change from Trump's in many parts of the world, he believes will be much better able to accomplish those goals by working in concert with other countries. And China is certainly exhibit A in that regard. And actually, as some of you may have seen, just yesterday, President Xi made it clear that he did not like this Biden approach. He warned about the possibility of a, quote, new Cold War, and talked about how damaging that could be. So multilateralism versus unilateralism is the biggest change. Also Russia. We've already seen the Biden administration offering very, very forceful pushbacks on a number of fronts. Biden is expected to call out Vladimir Putin for the arrest of the opposition leader Alexei Navalny in the crackdown on Navalny's supporters over the weekend. We expect Biden to push back much harder on the recent cybersecurity breach. And we expect Biden to press allegations that Russia offered the Taliban bounties to kill American troops in Afghanistan in a much more forceful way than the Trump administration did. So big change in Russia. Obviously, on climate change, Biden has already rejoined the Paris Accords. Big changes in Yemen, much more aggressive approach with Saudi Arabia, much more engaged on global health matters, and big change on immigration and refugee policy. We'll talk about all of these in the weeks ahead. But a lot's going to stay the same too. Even though Biden wants to shore up his relationships with other countries to take on China more effectively, I think when it comes to the substance of Biden's approach, we'll see a very similar approach to China, whether it relates to military or economic or human rights issues. It's notable that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, in the closing days of the Trump administration, referred to the Chinese government's maltreatment of the Uyghurs as genocide. And I don't think Biden's going to back down from that. Biden is going to leave the U.S. Embassy in Israel and Jerusalem. He'll continue to work to expand the Abraham Accords that Trump started. Very similar approaches in Venezuela in opposition to Maduro, and very similar approaches when it comes to trade. Our trade war is not over, and we'll talk about this in the future too. We'll see tariffs continue at a very heightened level. We saw Biden yesterday emphasize a Buy America campaign. So very much when it comes to international commerce and trade, my guess is we'll see Biden continuing in the same direction as Trump to a much greater degree than you might have expected on the campaign trail. In all likelihood, Biden will allow Trump's decision to withdraw most of our troops from Afghanistan to continue. And finally, even though Biden has talked very frequently about re-entering the nuclear arms agreement with Iran, that's a long way off. And so at least for the foreseeable future, I don't see much changing, at least substantively on that front. Plenty of other issues to talk about, both internationally and domestically, but that's why we do this every week. So next week, we'll come back and talk about more of them, but now for the next half an hour, let's go to your questions. And if Jessica can join me, let's begin my favorite part of every week's program, when I stop talking and start listening, and then do my best to answer the really smart questions that all of you put before us. So Jessica, how are we doing? What have we got?
We've got a lot coming in. We actually did a program on Afghanistan yesterday that I think just got uploaded to YouTube, talking about the potential troop withdrawal and trying to guess at what Biden will do. So if anyone's interested, check that out. So we have several questions about the filibuster coming in. The first question says, please discuss the filibuster. In a polarized, dysfunctional government, McConnell will use it to sabotage the Democratic agenda. Why not get rid of the filibuster, since it undermines the will of the people?
Well, the president has always argued against getting rid of the filibuster because he believes, number one, that whichever party is in the minority, right now it's Republicans, but at some point in the future will be Democrats, that they deserve to have their voices heard and do deserve some influence in how the government operates. And as the questioner implies correctly, there's a growing amount of pressure within Democratic ranks for Biden and Schumer to withdraw the filibuster. But Biden philosophically, of course, is a creation of the Senate. He served there for decades. And even though the world is a much different place than it was during much of the time that he served there, he still believes that if a president approaches the US Senate in the right way, that there can be work done across party lines. And in the past, when Biden was vice president and McConnell was majority leader, Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden were actually able to get a lot done. And I think Biden worries with some justification that by eliminating the filibuster altogether, it would make it almost impossible to proceed toward the types of bipartisan unity that he's been talking about for some time. Now we'll see what happens. If the Republicans aren't willing to meet him, maybe not halfway, but part of the way on the COVID relief bill, he may end up, and in fact is likely to end up, resorting to reconciliation and a straight majority vote party line outcome on the COVID relief legislation. But I think he's going to be very reluctant to eliminate the filibuster just because it really does fly in the face with much of the language and worldview that he's forwarded over his career. One other thing on this, which I would offer as just a cautionary note. Many of us remember when the Democrat Senate majority decided some years back, out of understandable frustration in not being able to confirm President Obama's judges, they decided to lower the threshold for confirming appellate judges from 60 votes to 51. And Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell warned them at the time. He said, look, you're not going to have the majority forever. At some point, Republicans will be in the majority again, and your decision to eliminate the supermajority for appellate judicial appointments is going to cause you real problems. And of course, what did McConnell do when Republicans retook the majority? Well, he followed the Democrats' lead and he eliminated the supermajority for Supreme Court nominations. And the result was that President Trump was able to confirm 3 justices over the course of his 4 years. So in addition to the broader ideals that Biden has talked about as a candidate and now as president about bipartisanship and about unity, the other concern is a much more practical one. If at some point in the not too distant future, Republicans do win the majority back, getting rid of the filibuster might help Democrats for the time being now, but could cause real challenges for them when Republicans are in the majority again.
Thank you. I saw some Dems giving Manchin grief for saying that he wouldn't support eliminating the filibuster, but I thought he actually provided some cover for both McConnell and Schumer to move forward. Is he now the most powerful senator of either party?
So Joe Manchin, the Democratic senator from West Virginia, is almost certainly the most conservative or moderate member of the Democratic Senate caucus, along with Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona, and possibly John Tester, the senator from Montana. And what that means is that those centrist Democrats in the Senate have an extraordinary amount of power, because even when Vice President Harris comes to vote with the Democrats, that's still only 51 votes. And what that means is that no Biden legislation can pass, no Democratic legislation can pass, unless the Democrats vote unanimously for it. Because Manchin is the most conservative member of the caucus, that probably does make him the most important member of the United States Senate. And I'd say probably a close second after Manchin might be Susan Collins, the most moderate centrist Republican, who could provide Biden those votes on other matters. But for the most part, the questioner is exactly right. If Joe Manchin doesn't think a bill should pass, then Democrats probably won't be able to get it through. So his importance is immense. Well, I'm not hearing you, Justin.
There we go. Please discuss the pros and cons of the Dems adding Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico as states this year.
Yeah, one of the less noticed aspects of the January 6th riots is how much more difficult it was for the District of Columbia to provide the type of public safety measures that were badly needed and not available. How much harder it was for the District of Columbia to do that simply because it wasn't a state. In 50 states in the country, a governor can call out the National Guard at a moment's notice. Because the district isn't a state, there's a much more convoluted process in how Guard troops can be made available. And the result, of course, the lack of action was tragic. The biggest challenge for making the district and Puerto Rico states is that most senators in both parties, particularly Republican senators, see it as a very partisan move. And so even if you can argue philosophically, partisanship aside, that the people of the district or the people of Puerto Rico deserve statehood, the practical impact in creating 2 new heavily Democratic states and therefore 4 new Democratic senators and skewing the balance in the Senate makes it almost impossible to do without getting rid of the filibuster. My guess is, and it's just a guess, is that if at some point in the future, whether under a Democratic or a Republican administration, if Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia are going to become states, it would become almost necessary. It would become necessary to create 2 new conservative-leaning states as well. So if for no other reason than so that the decisions could be made in terms of philosophical basis about representation, as opposed to one party benefiting at the expense of the other. So what does that mean? That means if the District of Columbia is going to become a state, that probably means that Northern California and Eastern Oregon would need to become a conservative leaning state too in order to pass it off. But either way, the key is separating out the philosophical questions from the partisan ones.
Can Donald Trump be subpoenaed to testify in the impeachment trial now that he is no longer president? Would you speculate that his testimony would or could be persuasive to his followers regarding the stolen election premise for protest?
Well, it's a terrific question. I have to admit, I don't know the answer. My guess is that any citizen, including a former president, can be subpoenaed to testify before the Senate. And so I don't know that there would be any exception here. The question about not whether he could be called, but whether he would be called, goes back to a point that I was making a little bit earlier in the program. The key decision for the Senate Democrats to make is how quickly do they want to get through this? Do they want to rush through and get it done because they don't think he's going to be convicted anyway? Or do they want to take a longer period of time in order to make a case before the country, either to possibly gain a conviction or simply to make the broader argument about Trump's behavior? If the Senate Democrats decide to move through this fairly quickly, I can't, and so that the administration and Congress can get back to the President Biden's policy priorities. If they decide to do this quickly, then I don't think there's much incentive for them to call Trump. If they decide that this is something worth a longer argument, then they certainly could. And the key strategic question for them becomes, is it to their advantage or disadvantage to give the former president such a high visibility national platform? I suspect that even if the trial goes on longer, Schumer and the senators who he appoints to oversee the trial and the House managers who will be in charge of presenting the evidence decide that giving Trump that platform is probably not a net benefit for them. But as you all know, I don't like to make predictions. And between now and 2 weeks from today, when the trial starts, there's no question that their calculations could change. So I think he can be called. The question is whether the Democratic House managers and the Senate leadership decide it's the right thing to do or not from a political standpoint.
We know a lot about President Biden's first few executive orders, but what are the major focus points at the moment of Vice President Harris? Is she focusing on a different set of issues behind the scenes? If so, what is her current focus?
Well, this is a really interesting question because for many years, going back to when Vice President Walter Mondale, Jimmy Carter's vice president, assumed a much larger policy agenda than his predecessors had. For many years, the vice president was given very specific issues on which to focus his and now her attention. The exception to that was Vice President Joe Biden. Barack Obama decided that except for a couple of specific matters, he didn't want to pigeonhole Biden on very specific issues, but rather wanted him available to assist the president in the White House on a whole range of domestic and foreign policy challenges. I think Biden clearly decided from his own 8 years as vice president that that broader role was more important than going deeper on a couple of very specific issues. And it appears that President Biden and Vice President Harris have come to the same conclusion. So I think it's unlikely that Harris will be taking on many high-profile policy challenges. But again, more broadly, like Biden did with Obama, working with the president to augment his efforts on a number of fronts.
Thank you. We've got this question a few times. So how likely are Republicans to boycott the impeachment trial and thus lower the number required to get to 2/3 of the senators present?
It's possible, but at least right now it doesn't appear that it's necessary. Because as we talked earlier, the likelihood of 17 Republicans voting for conviction looks pretty slim. And so for Trump's defenders, who would be tempted to stay away under a closer vote in order to change that calculation, there's not really a reason for them to do it now. So unless something dramatic changes, And as our group predicted, a number of Republican senators vote to convict, but not 17. There's really not much of a reason for the president's defenders to stay away. And in fact, for those who benefit politically from standing up in public on behalf of Trump, having the platform of the Senate during an impeachment conviction trial actually could work to their benefit. So if you're Senator Hawley, if you're Senator Cruz, if you're Senator Graham, you don't want to stay away. You want the microphone and the cameras and the spotlight to stand up for President Trump in order to remind his supporters that you're with him too.
How will Biden deal with the southern border?
Boy, one of the issues, Jessica, we're going to have to figure out a way to get into in much more detail is the question of immigration. And as many of you saw, almost immediately after taking office, President Biden introduced very ambitious, very far-reaching immigration reform legislation. And what was to me so interesting about Biden's proposal is that while it was very sweeping when it came to questions regarding citizenship and naturalization and legalization, for most of the modern era, whenever a president of either party has proposed broad-based immigration reform, they've on one hand talked about citizenship and naturalization and other legalization measures, but they've also talked as a balance about enforcement measures, border security, and other steps to be taken to discourage undocumented immigration. Except for a little bit of technology enhancement at the border, there's really nothing in Biden's proposal about enforcement at all. And that tells me that the Biden administration is very serious about broad-based immigration reform, but it also tells me that because they didn't include that balance in it, they realize that a bill like this is actually fairly aspirational, and it's probably not going to become law anytime soon. The most likely outcome for Biden's immigration proposal is compromise. And this, of course, gets back to questions about the filibuster. We can talk about it in that context at another time. But if by proposing something very, very ambitious as Biden did, that leaves him in a position to perhaps compromise down to get through a pathway to citizenship for the dreamers, those young people who came to this country as children with their parents, and possibly a path to citizenship for those temporary arrivals, those who came from great strife or discomfort in their home countries. So it doesn't look like Biden is going to do a great deal at the border. He's issued an executive order to stop construction of the wall construction. But other than that, with the exception of some technology, it looks like Biden's immigration efforts in the immigration area are going to be on the legalization and citizenship side, as well as a considerable amount of money to engage in what he believes are the root causes of mass undocumented immigration, and a lot of money and a lot of U.S. support for the Central American countries from whom so many immigrants are now, from where so many immigrants are now traveling. So much less of an emphasis on border security, not just than Trump, but than past presidents of either party. And ultimately, I think the citizenship goals he's outlined will be winnowed down, at least in the short run, to address those few very specific groups. And then Biden obviously hopes going forward, if he does this piece by piece, he can accomplish the broader proposal in years 2, 3, or 4 of his presidency.
Does bipartisan and unity have the same meaning for both Republicans and Democrats?
I don't think the term bipartisan and terms of bipartisan unity have the same meaning for any two human beings. We all define those concepts as we see them. And I think it's human nature to define those terms in a way that works to our benefit. There's a pretty decent amount of public opinion polling that shows that when you ask voters, do you want Congress to compromise in order to get things done? Huge majorities say, yes, we do. Then when the questions are asked more specifically, Do you want members of your own party, Republican or Democrat, to compromise on this particular issue in order to get something done? Then support falls off by a pretty dramatic margin. So my own opinion is that the very large majority of Americans who say they want bipartisan unity do, but they want the other side to do most of the compromising in order to get there. Where I give Biden credit, not as a partisan, but just as an observer, so I think he understands that dynamic, that you're not going to get the other side to concede on anything considerable unless you're willing to give up on something too. In the immigration bill I talked about a moment ago is a good example of that. I think he realizes, even if he can't say it out loud right now, Biden, that he's not going to get as big and bold a bill as he has proposed. So he'll give up some of it in order to get the other party to give up something so that they can move forward. Do Republicans and Democrats define bipartisanship differently? Of course they do. Both sides, for the most part, define it on their own terms.
This questioner says, does Dan see any partisanship on the Democrat side in dealing with the coronavirus in all aspects? Vaccine distribution, encouraging cities to open up more now that he's in office, etc.
Boy, do I see bipartisanship on the Democratic side as it relates to the COVID measures? And I would say I do, but no more or less than I do among Republicans. At a certain point, every elected official has to draw a distinction between political motivations for public policy and political ramifications for taking those policy steps. And to me, this is a really, really important difference. If I only do something for my community, whether it's on COVID or anything else, because it's good for me politically, and I'm politically motivated, that means I'm sacrificing the well-being of my constituents for my own political goals, and that is unforgivable. That said, almost any public policy action that I take on COVID or any other issue is going to have partisan political ramifications. There's no way around it. And I think smart politicians on both sides understand that policy doesn't take place in a political vacuum. It just shouldn't be motivated primarily by political motivations. So are Democrats politically motivated? Some are, just like some Republicans are. But the best in both parties, while they recognize that their actions will have political ramifications in terms of potential outcomes, they act on what they believe is best for the people they represent. And Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, understandably come to different conclusions about how to prioritize those policy goals.
How can mainstream news media, for example, CNN, adjust to the drop in viewership with Trump gone? Will there be a temptation to keep covering Trump and his family to keep ratings up?
Well, I think a lot of the mainstream news media harbors a little bit of guilt and believes that they gave Trump more attention than he deserved at the outset of his presidential campaign in 2015, in 2016. And so their instinct now, my guess is to overcorrect and to undercover him because they don't want to be in a position of giving him a platform as they did when he first arrived on the national political landscape. That said, for most professional journalists, it's pretty difficult to resist covering Donald Trump when he's trying to make news. The fact that he doesn't have his Twitter account makes that somewhat more challenging. But if any former president of the United States wants to make news, it's not that hard for them to do it. Cable television viewership will subside, particularly on CNN, and the temptation will be to give more attention to Trump to get those ratings back up. Fox, on the other hand, I suspect they might do pretty well because now they'll be in a position to more forcefully criticize the president rather than feeling an obligation to offer some defense. And that might be of some benefit to their core audience as it was during the Obama presidency. But on balance, I think those the cable TV networks are going to be losing audience, if only because Joe Biden, by intent, is not going to be as newsworthy on as constant and ongoing a basis as President Trump was. That said, in an internet era, in an era of social media, for those of us who want news and information about this administration and other topics, there's plenty of places to get it other than the cable TV shows.
Several people were asking if the Supreme Court is going to weigh in on the constitutionality of impeaching a non-sitting president.
It doesn't appear so. The court does not look particularly enthusiastic about getting involved in the trial one way or the other. And it now looks like Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, the president pro tem of the Senate, the longest serving senator in the majority party, will preside over Trump's trial rather than Chief Justice Roberts, as it's been interpreted by the Senate parliamentarian that the Chief Justice presides over a trial of a president, not of a former president. And so my guess is Roberts has been so focused over the course of his time as Chief Justice of doing everything he can to keep the court out of partisan politics that my guess is that if there's any way for him to avoid having the court rule on this, he will find a way for that to happen. And it looks more likely than not like the Senate will end up making that decision rather than the Supreme Court. But that's a most likely outcome, not a definite one by any means.
This will be my final question. How much of a toss-up does Ohio become with Portman retiring? Which party has the advantage in the upcoming race?
Well, Ohio, for much of the modern era, was considered to be the ultimate swing state, along with Florida. And if you could win Ohio, you could win the presidency. And over the last several years, Ohio has become more conservative and become more reliably Republican state. Although Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown has been elected there on more than one occasion, which means the Democrats can win statewide in Ohio. They're just disadvantaged. So incumbents are always in a better position to win re-election than the party is to win an open seat. So Portman's retirement, almost by definition, makes Ohio more competitive for the Democrats than it would have been had a respected and well-liked senator in that state decided to stand for re-election. The real question for the Republicans is who from their party emerges as the nominee. It's already looking very, very probable that Representative Jim Jordan, who is one of President Trump's strongest defenders in the House of Representatives and has been for 4 years, is seriously considering the state. And as Republicans have dealt with in the past, when they've nominated more extreme or more doctrinaire or more controversial candidates, that's created a more competitive general election environment. There are 2 or 3 what I would call more mainstream Republicans, pre-Trump Republicans, if you will, considering the race. If one of them were to win the nomination, then I think you'd have to say that they would be the favorite in a general election Senate race next year. But if Jordan or another strong pro-Trump voice were to emerge as the nominee, then that does create a greater opportunity for Democrats. So lack of an incumbent helps the Democrats right away. After that, we have to see who emerges from the Republican primary before we could have an understanding of how competitive that state is going to be. But when the fight for the Senate next year is going to be as pitched as you might imagine, given the current 50-50 makeup, Portman's decision to resign, like Patrick Toomey's decision to not to run for re-election, Portman's decision, like Patrick Toomey's decision in Pennsylvania, like Richard Burr's in North Carolina, do create opportunities for Democrats and create advantages for them in what will be a very critical midterm election.
Right. Lot to cover in the coming weeks and months. So thank you so much, Dan. Kim, I'll turn this back over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. Terrific job as always. Dan, thank you as always for the clarity and perspective. We always appreciate it, and we can't wait till next Tuesday. For all of our viewers, our live streams are going to continue to be a strong part of our product line throughout 2021. We do plan to also bring back our in-person events when it's safe to do so. So we'll continue to provide these live streams for free as a public service. So please consider making a contribution to cover our production costs. you can text the name Schnur to the phone number on the screen, and we appreciate anything that you can give. Also, if you're not a member of the World Affairs Council Town Hall, please consider joining. You can find out all of our benefits on our website. We have a terrific lineup of programs this week. On the 28th is India, the next global superpower. Also on the 28th, our young professionals are producing a program focused on globalization after 2020, reset or retrench. On February 4th, building national security in an unstable world with the former FBI assistant director. On the 12th, we have a high school program. As you know, we support bringing high school students as part of our civic engagement and discussions, and that will be focusing on Gen Z, how they can shape the future of technology. That's open to everyone. And on the 19th, of course, we have Bill Gates focusing on his book, How to Avoid Climate Disaster. So please go to our website, lawacth.org, and register today. Please stay safe, stay informed, and can't wait to see you next week on Tuesday, Dan.